All right, let's talk about Operation Barbarossa. When you look at the history of warfare, there are very few invasions that can even come close to its absolutely massive scale and devastating impact. Honestly, this operation completely changed the entire course of World War II. So to really wrap your head around the scale here, let's just start with one number, 3 million. That is how many soldiers Germany and its allies sent charging into the Soviet Union on a single day. And that one day kicked off one of the most brutal conflicts in all of human history. So this was a total surprise attack. On June 22nd, 1941, this massive force just rolls across the border. And what made it such a shock was that up to this point, Germany and the Soviet Union actually had a deal, a non-aggression pact, which is basically a promise not to fight each other. Well, in an instant, that promise was completely shattered. So you have to ask, why? Why this massive betrayal? Well, it really boiled down to three main things. First, territory. Hitler was obsessed with this idea of living space, which was land he wanted to conquer for German settlement. Second, it was about ideology. He absolutely despised communism and was determined to destroy it. And third, resources. The Germans desperately wanted to capture things like the rich grain fields of Ukraine. And, the German high command was incredibly confident about this. They weren't planning for a long, drawn-out war at all. The whole plan was for a quick, decisive victory, a knockout blow. They expected to be done in just a few months, way before that brutal, infamous Russian winter arrived. All right, so the German Blitz. How exactly were they planning to win so fast? Well, they were counting on a military strategy that had, up to this point, basically steamrolled its way across the rest of Europe. Okay, let's break this down. Their main strategy was called Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war, and the name really tells you everything you need to know. The whole idea is to create shock and confusion by hitting the enemy with overwhelming force, surprise, and speed. You move so fast that they just can't react in time. So how did it actually work? Well, it was kind of like a three-step process. First, you've got your armored tank divisions. Their job is to just punch a hole right through the enemy's front line. Then, step 2, motorized infantry follows right behind the tanks to surround big groups of enemy soldiers, trapping them. And all of this is happening while step 3 is going on. The Air Force, the Luftwaffe, is dominating the sky, attacking airfields, and supporting the guys on the ground. And in the beginning, this strategy worked, it worked perfectly. In just the first few weeks, the German army absolutely tore through the Soviet defenses. They advanced hundreds of miles and captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. It really looked like the Soviet Union was about to completely collapse. But here's the thing. Despite those massive, catastrophic early losses, the Soviet Union just did not break. And their response was going to be every bit as huge and determined as the invasion itself. So the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, gets on the radio and gives this incredibly powerful speech. He calls on everyone to fight in what he named the Great Patriotic War. And this one speech completely changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just a war for soldiers anymore. It was a fight for the very survival of their country, and every single person was expected to pitch in. And the response was just immense. Of course, millions of people joined the military. But what was happening behind the lines was maybe even more incredible. They literally dismantled entire factories. We're talking all the heavy machinery, put them on trains, and shipped them hundreds of miles east, over the Ural Mountains, where they could be safely rebuilt to keep producing tanks and planes for the war. The Soviets also used another tactic as they retreated. It was absolutely brutal, but it was also incredibly effective at slowing down the German army. This was the scorched earth policy. As the Soviet armies fell back, they destroyed everything that might be useful to the Germans. They burned crops in the fields, they blew up bridges, they demolished buildings. The goal was simple. When the German army arrived, they would find absolutely nothing. No food, no shelter, no supplies. Nothing. Okay, now we get to the part where the German war machine, which seemed unstoppable, ran into two enemies it just couldn't beat. You can't defeat them with tanks, you can't defeat them with planes. I'm talking about the sheer size of the country and, of course, the infamous General Winter. So this really raises the big question, right? This German army had conquered most of Europe. They took over France in a matter of weeks. What went so wrong in the Soviet Union? Why did this seemingly unstoppable military force just grind to a halt? Well, the answer really comes down to the huge difference between what the Germans expected and what they actually got. They planned for a quick summer fight on nice paved roads, like in France. Instead, they got a long, brutal war on dirt roads that turned into rivers of thick mud during the fall rains. They planned for short supply lines, but theirs were stretched over 1,800 miles. And then the winter hit. We're talking temperatures dropping to 30 degrees below zero, and often even colder than that. And remember, the whole plan was based on a quick victory, so the German soldiers weren't even equipped with proper winter gear. The cold itself became a weapon, just as deadly as any Soviet soldier. So, on top of the weather, the Germans' single biggest weakness was revealed: logistics. Now, logistics is just a fancy word for getting all your stuff, your troops, your equipment, your supplies, to where it needs to be. The analogy is perfect. An army is like a high-performance car. It doesn't matter how amazing the engine is if you run out of fuel. Logistics is the fuel. And for the Germans, it became a total supply nightmare. For one, the Soviet railway tracks were a different width than German ones, which created huge traffic jams for supplies. Their trucks got stuck in all that mud, fuel couldn't get to the tanks at the front, spare parts for broken vehicles were nowhere to be found. You had soldiers who were literally starving and freezing hundreds of miles inside enemy territory because their supplies were stuck way, way behind them. So now we get to the turning point. All of these things we talked about, the fierce Soviet resistance, the scorched earth policy, the mud, the freezing cold, and the breakdown of supplies, it all came to a head in the winter of 1941, right at the gates of Moscow. The German army launched one last massive push to capture the capital, an attack called Operation Typhoon. And they got so close. Some German soldiers reported they could literally see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance. They truly believed that if they could just take Moscow, the war would finally be over. But here, the exhausted, poorly supplied Germans ran into a wall. The Soviets had brought in fresh troops all the way from Siberia. And unlike the Germans, these soldiers were well fed, they were fully equipped with winter clothing, and they were trained to fight in these exact conditions. So what you have is an exhausted, freezing army facing off against a fresh, prepared one. And that's when the Soviets launched a huge counterattack. They completely surprised the weakened Germans, pushing them back from Moscow and handing them their very first major defeat of the entire war. This is the moment that so many historians point to as Hitler's single greatest mistake. Because that failure, it was absolutely catastrophic for Germany. It forced them into a two-front war, fighting in the West, and now this massive, brutal war in the East that they simply couldn't win. This was the beginning of the end for them. And it leaves you with a really chilling thought. What might have happened? How different would our world be today if that incredible gamble had actually succeeded?